Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Industry Week webcast, Going Beyond Status Quo Supply Chains, sponsored by Lean DNA. My name is Peter Freddy, Technology Editor with Industry Week. Before we begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First, if at any time you're having audio difficulties or slides are not advancing, pressing your F5 key will refresh your webcast console. If you are running a pop-up blocking software, you will need to disable it to view the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the !help button in the upper right corner to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the maximize icon in the upper right corner to enlarge the window. We do welcome your questions during today's event. Please use the Ask a Question window on the left side of your screen and then hit the Submit button to send questions in to our presenters. We will answer as many questions as possible following the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time and we will add them to the queue. Also, be aware that we are recording today's session. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available on the Industry Week website. When the webinar ends, please take a moment to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen. I would now like to welcome today's speakers. Richard Lebovitz is President and CEO of Lean DNA, the only provider of factory-focused inventory optimization solutions. Richard has been fighting for factories and people in them since the earliest days of his career. A more than 30-year supply chain veteran, Richard has worked with manufacturers around the world in engineering, sales, and lean strategy roles to empower factory-level employees with technology that increases efficiency and enables global scale. In the last year, Richard was named Supply and Demand Chain Executives Pro to Know of the Year, and the company was awarded the Next Gen Supply Chain Analytics Provider of the Year award. Bob Ferrari is founder and managing director of Ferrari Consulting and Research Group, an independent supply chain management industry analyst advisory and consulting firm. Bob is a highly visible supply chain thought leader and speaker who provides both a practical and thought-provoking perspective for global supply chain business process and information technology trends and developments. He is founder and executive editor of the universally recognized Supply Chain Matters blog. Paul Aram is Vice President of Global Operations for Ingersoll Rand, a leading manufacturer of compressors, vacuums and blowers, pumps, and more. With his expertise and specialization in design and implementation of lean processes and linking lean initiatives to company strategy, Paul has transformed businesses in multi-industry Fortune 500 companies throughout his career. Paul's been the Vice President of Global Operations at Ingersoll Rand since 2019, leading the organization through innovation and progress through a tumultuous time for global supply chains. With that, welcome, Richard. The floor is yours.
Great, Peter, and thanks for the introduction, and thank everyone for joining us today. It's not a secret the supply chain has been going through significant challenges over the last 12 months. Together, Paul, Bob, and myself all have different views of this storm and its impact on manufacturing, factories, and the leaders who are trying to mitigate risk, handle shortages, and gain control over a very complex situation. I'd like to start with some introductions. As Peter mentioned, I'm Richard Lebovitz, CEO and founder of Lean DNA. I've been working in lean manufacturing and supply chain for the last 30 years, and my focus has been on bridging the gap between the domain side of lean manufacturing and building technology to help optimize the way these systems need to work. Lean DNA is a factory-centric, execution-focused SaaS analytics solution that can quickly connect to any ERP system and empower supply chain teams to reduce excess inventory, improve on-time delivery by reducing shortages, and establish what we call operational command. I'm now excited to introduce our panel, First is Bob Ferrari, who's the founder and managing director of the Ferrari Consulting and Research Group. Bob? Bob? Peter, are you able to hear Bob?
Okay, I'm sorry. I was on mute. Let me start again.
Sorry, Bob. No, it's real time. No problem. Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join Richard and Paul on this webinar. My background includes 30 years of experience, multifaceted experience, both as a practitioner, IT support manager, and as an industry analyst. As Peter has mentioned, I founded the Supply Chain Matters blog in 2008, where I serve as executive editor, and I am the former IDC Global Director leading supply chain management practice at that institution. Pleasure to be with you.
Great, Bob. Paul, it'd be great to have you introduce yourself as well. Excited to have you here.
Hi, Richard. Hi, everybody. This is Paul Aram. I'm Vice President of Global Operations for Ingersoll Rand, PST division, which is a $900 million business unit within Ingersoll Rand. I've been in operations and supply chain all of my career for the last 30 years, working globally in many countries, specifically in China. Really, the thing that I'm trying to do with Ingersoll Rand now is to use operations and supply chain to give ourselves a competitive advantage through service differentiation. So happy to talk to you today. Thank you very much.
Great, Paul. Thank you. So why don't we start out by setting a little bit of the stage around what we're going to be talking about during the webinar. We're calling this a perfect storm in supply chain right now. We're hearing a lot of customers who are running into challenge after challenge as demand steps back from COVID-19. Let's start with Paul, who's the VP of Global Operations Ingersoll Rand. Paul, can you start out by giving us your perspective on today's current challenges and what you're seeing right now?
Sure, Richard. Yeah, I think probably what we're seeing is the same as what many people are seeing. We've gone through last year, 2020, going through the beginning of the COVID crisis with both ourselves having to take some significant action in terms of cost management to protect what we thought was going to be lower levels of business through the course of the year. In the end, we managed to keep our revenues to within about 5 to 10% of our budget, and our profits actually were slightly above where we originally planned. During the course of last year, many of our supply base, and we are often assembling products and therefore really reliant on our supply chain, many of our suppliers were cutting costs, cutting inventory, and laying off or furloughing staff. And many of them also had some cash flow issues, as many of their customers, not us, I must say, but many of their customers were trying to do a lot of cash preservation and delaying payments. So many of our suppliers were going through a really difficult time. And really what's happened is as we come into 2021, the whole environment has changed with demand really accelerating rapidly. Certainly for us at Ingersoll Rand, our demand is, our plan was about 10% above last year, and we're running about 25% above plan right now. That's causing a lot of problems with our suppliers as they haven't quite matched their capacity with to match the increased demand, not just with us, but with many of our competitors and many of the other customers of our suppliers. So we got this sort of really big demand and capacity imbalance that we're trying to work through. And on top of that, we've got many of our supply chains coming in from low-cost country regions, particularly India and China. And transportation lead times have really gone out significantly. So we're seeing container shipment times from China, for example, which we used to rely on coming in 4 to 5 weeks, extending up to double that. So that's causing a lot of issues as well in terms of supply. So it is a bit of a perfect storm at the moment that we're trying to work through.
Great, Paul. Thanks. Bob, do you want to give your perspective on the current situation and what we're seeing as that perfect storm?
Yeah, I think as Paul mentioned, COVID directly impacted so many manufacturers in that exact way. And even before this storm, things were already brewing. COVID landed on top of an already budding customer-driven supply chain where outside forces like fast-paced customer demands came in and now are converging with manufacturing. It's shifting the way companies have to think about their approach. Instead of outside in, where companies seek to optimize their four walls manufacturing processes, we have to now think about customer first and their specific product and service needs. Layer that on top of COVID and now the Suez Canal issues, countless shortages of basic resources like steel, plastics, and now semiconductors. And it's not surprising that President Biden made his official order about finding ways to keep supply chains more resilient.
Bob and Paul, it is definitely a challenging time, and we're seeing the same challenges with a lot of our customers here at Lean DNA. And I'm hearing this from a lot of industry leaders we talk to who are struggling with both major part shortages while at the same time trying to reduce excess inventory. So they're really challenged to do both. But mostly I hear from manufacturers who are looking for improved visibility into what's coming as the first step to resiliency. But let's talk more about resiliency. As you mentioned, Bob, previously, Biden is mandating it, but what does that really look like in practice? Bob, what are some of your thoughts?
Well, really, Richard, it remains about balancing and mitigating supply network risks. It's factoring in lean thinking, not just for optimal efficiencies and Kanban and inventory replenishment, but coupling that with risk factors such as single source parts, elongated global transportation times that Paul alluded to, supplier capacity constraints. It's all of that.
Great. Paul, do you want to hit on your perspective of what is needed around a resilient supply chain?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we're having to have a look at our total supply chain and have a look at where we were doing a lot of sole sourcing before. We need to have some dual sourcing activity just to protect us going forward. But in general, what we're looking at is to make our teams more efficient and take away some of the non-value added work that they're doing. So we want to largely automate our processes, both with demand coming in and the way that we execute demand with our suppliers. And we're looking at ways as to how we do that and how we get better data to be able to do that. Specifically, we, like a lot of companies, Ingersoll Rand used to rely on looking at historical data to try and estimate what was going to happen in the future. And I think with the volatility that we've seen recently, that's not going to work. So we really need to be much, much smarter in the way that we design our processes to make the way that we do things much quicker, much more nimble, and much more efficient, so that our teams are working far more to exceptions and doing the right things rather than doing non-value-added routine work.
Great, Paul, thanks. You mentioned some things around kind of efficiency and non-value-added activities, and that kind of ties into a lot of the area of lean supply chain and lean manufacturing and lean thinking. And we're going to come back to the notion of lean thinking and all of this, but you mentioned something interesting there, Paul, the usage of historical data, that might not cut it anymore. We've seen that at Lean DNA as well with other, what we're calling status quo processes. That is systems and processes that aren't keeping up with the challenges caused by more variable demand, while at the same time seeing increased product complexity. Bob just touched on it too. There's a new mindset we must adopt to keep up with and build resiliency. And the older approaches aren't cutting it anymore. What happened? Paul, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely the old processes won't work. Some of the things you've got on the screen here, if you go to the sort of planning and purchasing department of a factory and they're sitting there looking at spreadsheets rather than looking at that ERP system screens, then there is normally something wrong. And it's normally a question of trust and knowledge of how the system works, and potentially data on the system being wrong. So the trust disappears and people resort to spreadsheets to work. That makes the whole process far too manual and laborious, and you start to get a disconnect between what the people are doing and what's actually happening on the shop floor. So again, for us, it's trying to build some much greater intelligence into the way that we look at our data, to use tools that allow us to model various scenarios, such as, if containers are going to be delayed, if we have a quality problem, if we change suppliers. So really, we need to be looking much more proactively and modeling what we want to be doing, rather than just, as it says here, sifting through old data that is really not very useful anymore.
Great, Paul, thanks. Bob, as Paul mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities and changes that we need to start to drive towards. And you see a perspective not only at a single entity or a few companies, you talk to a lot of different enterprise companies out there around not only planning but operations. What do you see as some of the needs today for companies?
Well, obviously, Richard, many companies now are seeking end-to-end multi-tiered supply chain visibility. And really, candidly, that can take some time for a company to achieve. It involves multiple nodes in a particular company supply network, and indeed, it includes manufacturing. So because of this, we're moving away from the notion of just supply chain planning alone, and now we need to really factor the synchronization of execution in manufacturing as well as customer fulfillment. The goal is often visibility to unplanned activities, as well as the ability to constantly synchronize material flows across the network. Now, at a minimum, manufacturing teams need the ability to manage constantly changing information while understanding and prioritizing the implications of those changes. This is really what the perfect storm has caused. So in short, Richard, we're moved into a goal of not only planning, but more importantly, synchronization of activities, which is similar to lean practices and thinking. I know you're going to get in touch with that subject later, but really it's about manual processes are not really cutting it anymore. And planning without synchronization of execution isn't going to work either. That's the status quo. And it really is about how do you balance proactive planning with responsive decision making.
So that leads into a good question, and one that we actually want to launch a survey real quick for those that are attending. We'd like to get your feedback on the question, how are you balancing proactive planning with responsive decision making today? And I'm going to go ahead and send the survey out to the audience. And if you could take a look at those questions, we'll give the audience a few moments to respond to them. And let me just pull this up here. So the questions were, just to read through them as you're looking, we're not very manually with spreadsheets and emails. We don't have time for planning right now. We're using our historical data and plans from pre-COVID, or I'm not sure. So I'll go back and give the audience a few minutes to respond. And I think some of the results, I'm sure for many of you as we're looking at them coming in, are something we probably all live every day when we think about the gap between a lot of the technology at the enterprise side and what are we really seeing day to day for the people running manufacturing in factories. What are they challenged with? It looks like we're starting to get a pretty strong trend here. And let me go ahead and send the results out. We'll take a look at what we found. So if you look at it, it looks like the results were One is we're using our historical data and plans from pre-COVID, which looks like one of the most common responses. Actually, it looks like B is very manual with spreadsheets and email. So actually, that's pretty typical of what we found. It looks like number 2 would be we're using our historical data and plans for pre-COVID, and then the last one was I'm not sure. So ironically, when we talk about how people are actually, let me put the survey back up. When we talk about how people are managing production every day, I was just talking to an industry analyst about this one question, and he said, which I love, ERP means Excel runs production. I think you see that here in the results, that for most people, the way they're dealing with these issues is very manual with spreadsheets and emails. And as Paul mentioned, what I think he's experienced as well, and we've talked about this a lot, is this need for automation and having tools that are built for people. So you can't balance proactive planning, responsive decision making with spreadsheets anymore. And I think that's what we've seen as well. Spreadsheets are still huge in manufacturing, but enterprises are definitely feeling the pain right now from what we're seeing. And now there's so much change happening across the globe that by the time you manually change the information, the problem is the information is now obsolete. So we need processes and systems that can gather up the information faster and translate it into impact. Will it impact our plan? What do we need to do? How are tools transitioning? Why don't I let Bob kind of give his perspective on, what are some of the things that we could do to balance proactive planning with responsive decision making?
Yeah, and Richard, I'm not, that survey was fascinating because it indeed reinforces a lot of what we've all been thinking about, that, really forecasting methods have to be modified toward more sense and respond methodologies, sensing changes in product demand as they occur. The focus is now turning towards scenario-based decision-making predicated on different alternatives. This can be supplemented by, predictive or prescriptive analytic tools that determine scenarios or likely scenarios. Customers further continue to seek personalized products or different variants of their products. We're very much going into personalized products, and that's proliferating across many, many industries right now. And the most important thing today is really, as we've noted, it's about prioritization. Are your tools really helping to prioritize? Paul, what are you seeing at Ingersoll Rand about this?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a shift towards more predictive planning. That's where we need to get to, and we need to have the tools to be able to do that. So really, what we want to be looking at is what do we think will happen in the future, rather than looking too much backwards as to what used to happen in the past. And then being able to use the tools that we have to do some what-if decisions and analysis that will then in turn enable us to make the right decisions going forward. We try to use systems that were based around optimization and prioritization before. But we really need to do things much more quickly. Luckily for us, we already had a initiative that was underway before COVID happened. But if you're starting from today, really doing things quickly is really the most important thing. So I think that if you're spending a couple of years doing a lot of work and then everything changes, then you've wasted a lot of time doing the wrong thing. So really, I think that that's not the right solution today. We don't want to be looking at aggregating data and stuff like that. We just need to be looking at speed of decision making and forward planning.
Great, Paul. And just to add to that, I would say from my perspective, 10 to 15 years ago, I would say that using spreadsheets for analysis and reporting could work okay. But the challenge is that as factory management has become much more complex, those tools are no longer sufficient. The problem is that the factory needs for factory operations management is not always recognized. IT may think the problem is solved in many cases, but what we found is that operations are still struggling. The end result is they have to revert back to Excel, and that's why I think we see that in the survey, that while this problem is very well known, the tools that we're giving operations are still primarily Excel and very manual processes. What actually led me to start Lean DNA was this lack of tools that are built for supply chain teams in the factory, very purpose-built. The goal is to be able to quickly connect to these existing ERP systems in a matter of weeks versus months or years, and provide workflow and advanced analytics that will help them reduce excess inventory while at the same time improving on-time delivery. And the key for factories is they can't have one or the other. They need to do both. They need to optimize working capital, but at the same time, improve our on-time delivery rate. The key, I would say, is establishing these best practices and workflow that are built into the tool. And we wanted Lean DNA to be that type of SaaS platform that supply chain teams are excited to use. And the more excited they are, we feel, and the more it solves their day-to-day problems, that's where we start to see the adoption, we get in the engagement, and ultimately we get the results. It is important to discuss lean thinking in all of this we talked about earlier, because it's actually been a rather hot topic recently, especially during COVID and some of the challenges we're seeing in the supply chain. I am a lean guy, so I'm rather biased, but I'd love to hear what you two think. But for me, at its core, lean thinking is two things: making work easier for people and eliminating waste. Those two things are still quite relevant today. Not only is this being used in the factory, but we have shown and seen that it can also be used in the way that you design, build, and implement software. But the approach we need to take might be changing. Initially, it was about visual manufacturing. The idea was that if you build a good visual management system using tools like communication boards, physical Kanban, you actually don't need software. I was actually with a Japanese firm at the beginning of my career. My partners had come from Toyota and Honda, and they were always talking about simplicity, making things visual. And if you do that, you can have very simple software. But the problem is with the current trends, this isn't true anymore. ERP and planning was all back-end mystery systems. Lean made it simple and visual, and that worked for a period of time. But now that manufacturing products are becoming much more customized, it doesn't work by itself. So let's combine them into a hybrid model where we leverage the best of lean procurement, but we also still maintain this MRP-driven POs based on forecast and work to build systems that can do both and work well together. Bob, maybe I could give you a few moments to talk about what you and I know we've spoken quite a bit about regarding this connected supply chains and what it really means. Bob, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Richard, especially coming from a lean expert like yourself. From my perspective, visualization now takes on a broader perspective to be supported by digital tools. Another thing I keep hearing about from clients that I speak with is all the time and complexity of connections of supply chains. That connected manufacturing is what companies should be striving for, because the reality of the situation is the sense of material inbounds and outbounds, namely a network of factory to factory or factory to supplier connections. And I think that's getting much more prolific right now.
Bob, we agree, and we're seeing the same opportunity. And at Lean DNA, we actually view the optimal supply chain as a series of connected factories, not just isolated factories treated as a black box, but a lean factory connected to another lean factory, which could be a supplier or a sister site, and focus on how do we improve how those sites can work together and collaborate with accurate and trusted information. The factory is where execution happens, and this decides how well you can react to some of the challenges like COVID or the Suez Canal or the semiconductor shortage or the Texas freeze. The factory has become a key piece of manufacturing where resiliency hinges. The ability to reroute parts, find alternate suppliers, optimize capacity, how best we fill orders coming in. So there's a lot of challenges there that we can really start to attack, Bob, as you mentioned.
And Richard, how do you characterize the role of the factory right now?
Yeah, well, when we think about core lean thinking, as I mentioned earlier, eliminating waste and making people's lives easier, that happens at the factory level. The status quo, we're talking about the manual processes, the slow reaction time because of inaccurate data, the spreadsheets that were highlighted earlier in the survey, that's going to impact the back office of manufacturing. The people who are really struggling to make sure the factory has everything they need to deliver the products on time. With the customer-driven outside-in supply chain model, Bob, that you just talked about, we need to actually start at the factory. But the factory, unfortunately, has been left behind in past enterprise system transformations. And we're not talking about the factory floor, where there's a lot of automation and robotics. What we're talking about is what we call the factory operations management, where inventory decisions are made to ensure you have the right parts at the right time with optimized inventory. That's the challenging part, I would say, for today's enterprise. We'd now like to talk about a new way of thinking about managing inventory. Bob, can you talk a little bit about this hybrid model, which we're starting to allude to?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is where a hybrid model we've been teasing comes really to life. There is a movement to combine push and pull planning processes within manufacturing. And from my way of thinking, that's happening in a lot of industries right now. So for make-to-stock items, the optimal procurement method is sizing, is based on demand plans and delivery triggered through pull signals or pull-based planning. Ingersoll refers to this as lean fulfillment. Now, for make-to-order or engineered order models, product planning is predicated on an MRP-based planning model, where parts for configured products are procured based on specific customer orders. Within manufacturing, there is a need for planning and visibility among both pools of inventory. Depending on the industry, the pull-based process is the basis of a product postponement process at the factory with direct shipment to the customer.
Great. Paul, could you talk a little bit about this kind of different models and some of what you're seeing there at Ingersoll Rand in terms of the configured order or standard products versus the configured order or make to stock and how those are managed?
Sure. I mean, what we have done is we've divided the products we're making into three different categories: standard products, configured products, and engineered products. And nearly all of our factories have a combination of all three. And I think this is where the hybrid model comes in. For the standard products and the configured products, we want to do what we talked before, use the traditional lean type of modeling to be able to plan our material procurement and fulfillment strategies. So things like Kanbans and consignment stock and VMI, these sort of things, these fit that model very well. And then we want to add on top of that a lean planning process that is largely automated. So we think we can do that with the type of lean replenishment methods a lot of us are familiar with. But then when you get to the engineered to order products, the ETO products, by definition, these are products that have to go through some sort of engineering function before they can actually be launched into the factory. There's some sort of part or color or something that's different. And with those types of products, really using Kanbans and those sort of pull systems, they're really not appropriate. We want to be using MRP, and therefore we want to be using some sort of good methods to help us, like Lean DNA, to help us to optimize the way that we use the MRP process. So the way that we use the way that we plan our inventory and our fulfillment methods is really determined at Ingersoll Rand now by the type of product that we're going to be making, whether it's standard, configured, or engineered.
Great, Paul. And as you mentioned, the demand planning is probably getting better and better, but there's that tactical side that's really been left behind, where you can look at how do we need to size and manage those that are great candidates for lean procurement or lean fulfillment, such as Kanban or min-max or order point, and then identifying those that are better suited for more of a purchase based on MRP because they're needed for specific configurations. So we do see that there's that opportunity for dealing with that tactical execution that really helps the factories optimize what they do. And maybe, Paul, you could take a little bit of time here just to walking through what is Ingersoll Rand's challenges and goals and some of the things you've experienced at some of your recent work there.
Sure. I mean, we put together a vision as to what we're trying to do in terms of how we're taking demand into our facilities and how we're planning it and how we're then deciding on the strategies for our component and purchase parts. What we found is, obviously we've got a number of competing objectives that we're trying to do. Like everybody else, we're trying to maximize on-time delivery. We're trying to minimize lead time. We're trying to minimize inventory dollars and maximize inventory turns, and also save money on our purchase parts. So we have all of these normal sort of metrics we're trying to aim at. What we found in terms of inventory is that if you look at the STO and CTO products, and for us, that's where we're spending most of our purchasing dollars in those items. Although we're spending the most money, actually our inventory dollars, or the percentage of inventory that we have associated with those parts, is actually relatively low. And the reason for that is generally those parts are, the demand variance is lower. We use these parts very frequently. They're turning well, and we've already got fairly good inventory management strategies for those. Our problem is that the inventory that we have is more onto the ETO side. It's a minority of our business. It's the business that we've been running MRP on. And what we found is, although that may represent only maybe 25 to 30% of our revenues, the inventory associated with that is like 50 to 60%. So if we're looking at inventory management from a optimization perspective, then really we need to be looking at those parts that have traditionally been run on MRP and how we can optimize that. That's the biggest opportunity. And obviously on the STO and CTO, what we're really looking at is making sure that the component availability is there so that we can use that to reduce our lead times and improve our customer service levels.
And Paul, just to add what you had mentioned, I want the audience to really make sure they got that point, is that you may have high volume, very repetitive items, which represent, let's say, 20% of your part numbers, but 80% of your spend, while at the same time you may have a large number of parts, like 80% of your parts, but they actually represent a small portion of your spend, but could represent a large part of your inventory. So I think that's a critical,
That's right.
Critical point, Paul, that you made. And Paul, here, maybe just on those steps, I kind of highlighted 3 areas. Do you want to maybe add any comments around this kind of maybe a basic approach, the way to think about how to identify those first steps to take?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what we are trying to do is to actually, as I said at the beginning, is to develop a strategy in operations to improve our customer service levels and to be able to use that as a differentiator. So we're trying to get to a specified on-time delivery percentage and lead time mix, which we identify by product group and by STO, CTO, and ETO. And once you've done that, then you can then go through a mathematical model that will allow you to figure out what your capacity in the factory needs to be able to meet those service vision targets. And then in turn from that, what your inventory sizing needs to be able to meet the demands of that specified capacity level. So in a way, all of what we do in terms of our inventory planning is related to the service vision definition that we've started with. So that allows us to identify, once we've done that, which parts go on which replenishment method, whether we're going to use Kanban, whether we're going to use VMI, and also which parts we're going to continue to run on MRP. And then once we got those, then we can put in some good standard processes for how we work to be able to manage that and implement it over time. And to be quite, it's quite easy for us to track our progress in terms of meeting both the customer service objectives, but all the other objectives that go with it, specifically our inventory optimization and our inventory availability. So there are some sort of specific steps you need to be taking to be able to do this, but rather than trying to do it as a inventory reduction or an inventory optimization project, it's a subset of a larger customer service initiative where everything flows down from that.
Perfect, Paul. And just as a complement to the process that Paul just outlined, just want to highlight how the Lean technology helped him bring this to life. We see three components of this model that can be deployed through software. And the key is you need to combine the strategy that Paul outlined with technology that's very purpose-built with the domain expertise and the integrations to make it work. And we see three kind of components to that. The first is what we call total visibility, where we can connect to the ERP system, establish that trusted data, and create transparency across factories and systems. It's not just showing you how good or bad you are doing, which a lot of the BI tools will do, but it's really focused on showing you how to get better and help your team actually then execute. The second is what we call AI-powered intelligence, where we leverage domain-specific algorithms and learning systems to prioritize these top actions that will have the biggest impact on inventory or shortages. The challenge is factories aren't lacking data or action messages, but they don't know in an easy way, what are the 5 or 10 things I need to focus on today that's going to have the biggest impact on what Paul just talked about? What's going to impact my deliveries or what's going to impact my inventory levels? And then the third component is what we call workflow-based execution. And this is where we have workflow and dashboards that drive these best practices that we've built over many, many years. And this not only speeds up adoption, but it improves results and helps hold people accountable to achieving those goals. We also leverage this workflow to understand the root cause of the issues so that the individuals, the buyers, the planners, the analysts have confidence they're actually taking the right inventory action. And Paul, maybe we could have you just kind of summarize the playbook and how you approach this in terms of leveraging technology to complement the strategy that you're driving.
Right, thank you, Richard. So for our ETO parts, which are the ones that we're continuing to run on MRP, what we quickly found was that a lot of the people in our planning departments and our purchasing departments, they were using ERP systems and MRP. They didn't really know how these systems worked and didn't have enough information to be able to use them very well. And when we were introduced to Lean DNA, we could see that there was a real benefit for us because it made, first of all, the whole supply chain very visible. It displayed the information in a very easy way, but more specifically, it allows us to prioritize the actions that are really necessary to do every day and to monitor people's performance and make sure also that some of the MRP parameters that may have been set up wrongly can be corrected. The key thing for us is, we're trying to do everything quickly, is to find a piece of software that not only was relatively quick and easy to deploy, but would connect to our different ERP systems that we have at our different factories. So probably like a lot of companies, we don't have everything, one ERP system for the whole company. We've got numerous different ERP systems and different versions of different ERP systems. And one of the advantages of Lean DNA is that it can be easily connected to all of them. And so therefore the connection and the deployment can be down, as it says here, down in the sort of 4 to 6 week level. Once we got it sort of hooked up, then it allows us to configure it, to configure the software so it matches up the specific needs of that particular site. and some of the specific problems that they are experiencing. So that could be anything from the speed with which they're releasing purchase orders to looking at shortage management and looking forward to more strategic stuff, calculating PFEPs so that we can look to modify our parameters on MRP going forward, so it will work a little bit better than it used to in the past. So, you know, I find also that the site leaders at many of our facilities didn't really know what these groups were really doing. They're all sitting there working on spreadsheets. And one of the big advantages of Lean DNA is it gives these really good dashboards, which can be viewed by site leaders and even people like myself who can look at data from multiple sites at the same time and see how they're getting on, and both in terms of using the system, but in terms of the success that we're getting from the system. So it's been a relatively easy implementation and one that's given us very good results. For us, obviously, we're looking at inventory control and on-time delivery, but specifically, you know, in some of our factories, we were looking at managing shortages, and that's one of the key things that people are trying to do in the planning departments, is to look at eliminating shortages for work orders so they can get stuff to the production line quickly. We've seen a dramatic improvement in the number of shortages we have and the number of MRP messages that we have, and that's really given us the ability to be able to consequently improve not just our on-time delivery and inventory, but our communications to our customers and the accuracy of our communications as to what we're going to be doing.
Great, Paul, and obviously we've been enjoying the work together. And I would say when I got involved with technology and working on the early versions of Lean DNA, a lot of our goal was just to make the lives easier for the day-to-day operators around factories in terms of procurement teams and supply chain teams. And one of the things that I've heard that means a lot is this ability to just give people their weekends back. We do feel there's a lot of technology that's complicated within the enterprise, but at the same time, giving tools that are very purpose-built and solve these real problems that Paul talks about, it's exciting to see the results. And I think the world's shifting to where, you know, factories have traditionally been viewed as this black box, not well understood, but people really struggle. And to crack that open, turn it on its head, where now factory becomes the real critical link, and how do we empower them to be successful and not only drive better delivery, but better inventory, but make life easier for people to do that, I think is really, really powerful, Paul. So appreciate some of your perspective. And maybe, Bob, just to kind of close with you, you know, I know you talk to a lot of clients and you've seen leading indicators from clients who've weathered the storm better, doing different approaches and using different technology. Maybe you can talk about what else and who else is weathering the storm and what's happening.
Yeah, and let's focus on that just very briefly. You know, in addition to, you know, the Lean DNA clients in aerospace and medical devices, we can turn to probably one of the icons of lean thinking for a lot of manufacturing methodology, and that's Toyota. And how did they weather the current issues with the global-wide semiconductor shortage that's going on right now? And Toyota's response was something that the learning that they garnered from the 2011 Fukushima earthquake and tsunami that disrupted their supply network back then, and particularly the semiconductor supply network with Renesas. So as a result of that, after that event, Toyota undertook a complete inventory analysis of all of their parts related to manufacturing, and that included about 6,800 parts across multiple tiers of their manufacturing supply network. Now, they termed this program, this analysis, Rescue. That was the term they used, and it was basically a supply chain resiliency plan in my mind. Now, as a result of that, when the industry looks at Toyota's inventory levels over the last few years, remarkably, they've been one of the highest in the auto industry. But at the same time, when COVID came along and impacted so many auto manufacturers, Toyota was really able to weather that storm in terms of its own agility and resiliency. But more importantly, as we look at today and we look at the headlines that are going on today about production line disruptions occurring across multiple automakers, Toyota has not really been that much impacted because they've already put in the basis of that rescue plan. So they've developed buffer inventories in semiconductors, at least up to this point, to bring them through that. So I saw that as a real milepost in this kind of thinking in lean and what lean has to come to. And by the way, it's not just Toyota. The other day or this week, Bloomberg wrote about BMW and the same notions. BMW looked at supply resiliency way back and what that would involve, and certainly semiconductors was a part of that. And they've been managing to, fend off the shortage up until now. So we'll see, but that's the way it's been.
Let's see, and maybe just one last question. Paul, if you want to hit on this, like what advice would you give to people who want to implement this model today that we've just talked about?
Well, I mean, I guess if we're talking about having this mixed model where you're using MRP on some parts and lean fulfillment supported by pull systems for other parts, my main advice is try and get as much out of MRP as you can, right, and put as much on pull systems and non-MRP stuff as you possibly can. For the stuff that you have to leave on MRP, I think that we have to recognize that MRP is difficult to use. It's difficult, in my opinion, because it can't cope with changes that happen, during the time between you take an order and the time that you're delivering an order. And the type of changes I'm talking about are, suppliers delivering late compared to the purchase order due date, if there's a quality problem maybe, or customers change orders, and that's resulting in your buyers getting, sometimes thousands of these messages every day coming through saying to buy, cancel, expedite, de-expedite. If you're going to implement this model, you really need to be getting something to help you with those, to give your planners a fighting chance to know what to prioritize and what are the actions that have to be taken today. And it's all about, in MRP, minimizing the shortages that you would have, because it's the shortages that cause customer frustration, because you can't necessarily deliver what you said you were going to deliver, and you can't give accurate information to your customers. It's going to cause general on-time delivery problems, and it's going to cause increases in your inventory as the sequencing of your inventory loses the logic that's in the MRP system. So my advice to people implementing it is, as I say, if you're going to use MRP, try. It doesn't have to be Lean DNA. I'm not sort of advertising them specifically, but you want to have something like Lean DNA that's going to help you to manage all these messages that are coming through from the ERP system to eliminate the sort of things I've spoken about. So I hope that helps.
Perfect, Paul. That's a great way to wrap. And Peter, I think we can take a few questions here with the last 5 minutes that we have.
Yep, and we do have a number of questions, so let's just jump right in. Whatever questions we don't answer, I wanted to make sure you know that they will go to presenters to answer offline. First question that I have here, this one I think is for Paul. For large enterprises with a combination of make to stock and configure to order products, what tools should they leverage first?
That's a really interesting question, and I guess it depends on what your objectives are. What I found over the years is that a lot of operations people are tasked with doing things like reducing inventory and doing sort of internally facing things. For me, my recommendation would be is don't look at it that way. You want to be looking at what sort of fulfillment or customer service proposition you want to be giving to your customers. What do you need to be doing, and let all your other activity flow down from that, and don't do anything in sort of isolation, because it might make things better or it might make things worse. But for me, I obviously I would copy what we've done, which is to divide your products into these sort of standard configured and engineered categories, and then decide what the service definition needs to be for each of those, and then define your factory capacity and then your inventory levels that you need to put in place to be able to support that, and the replenishment capability.
All right, great. This next question is for Bob. When do you foresee us coming out of the current shortage storm that all manufacturers seem to be currently dealing with?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I'm sure it's on the top of mind of many manufacturers right now. And everything that I'm seeing right now indicates that we're going to be in this basically for the rest of 2021. What's happened here, if our viewers have been following what is going on here, there was a huge response from the global supply chain based on this change in demand that occurred at midpoint last year with COVID, with new product demands for certain products, and then with a complete inventory replenishment cycle. So we had this tidal wave of materials that were inbound to many global regions, and then we had, as we described in this webinar, the perfect storm of all these interruptions and disruptions in the Suez Canal, and then that led to the supply disruptions and things like that. So in sum total, if you look across the board, one disruption is causing another. And, to take one, I wrote about this last night, in the semiconductors alone, all right, the notion is there is only so much capacity right now. And for the semiconductor makers to come forward with new capacity, it's going to take 2 to 3 years. And with so much of that new capacity now coming online, there's already concerns about, well, can production equipment providers, can they respond to that inadequate lead times? And then there's other notions about, will that shortage cause other shortages among manufacturers? So it cascades. So the bottom line here is that realistically, we're going to go through the bulk of this year with a lot of these types of disruptions, unfortunately, and supply chain teams are going to have to just be able to respond to them.
All right. Next question here. I think this one's another one for Paul. What is the first step we can take towards digital transformation in the supply chain?
Gosh, that's a very good question. For us, what we're trying to do is to look at all of the non-value added activities that our supply chain teams do, and trust me, there's a lot of it. Looking at MRP and raising purchase orders and responding to messages is not value added. What is value added is looking forward and predicting problems and acting on exceptions. So for me, the first step I would do is to take a look at what your teams are actually doing, to value stream map it or something similar than that. Look at all of the non-value added activity you're doing, and then look at various ways that you can replace that with more automated processes. Exactly what those automated processes will be, I'd be happy to talk offline. There's various ways you can do it. But obviously there are established ways of communicating with suppliers, automatically getting demand to them, whether it's electronic Kanbans, whether it's schedule sharing, whether it's VMI type processes and stuff like that. Anything that you can do that will automate the process. The other big thing is automating the sort of production planning process at the front end. This is a bit that people often forget. You have these teams of people who are taking demand, you're running MRP, you're creating work orders, you're trying to allocate stock to it. There are mechanisms, and we've done it, where you automate that whole process. where the demand is coming in, going through some algorithms, and then demand is literally going in real time to the production line, and you're eliminating all of the wasted time that happens in the middle. So, I mean, the exact way of doing it is obviously lots of ways of doing it, but for me, the first step would be is looking at what your teams are actually doing and looking at how you can eliminate the wasted time that they're undertaking at the moment, and how you can make sure that what they're doing is always value added.
All right, great. Well, looks like we're actually at the top of the hour here. I'd like to thank everybody for participating, especially our speakers, Richard, Bob, Paul, as well as our sponsor, Lean DNA. On behalf of Industry Week, have a productive remainder of the day.